So the question I want to address is, what's the trouble with our K-12 school system? According to mainstream media, the two biggest symptoms are dropouts and underachievers. So according to National Center for Education Statistics, in 2012, any random white kid would have a 1 in 25 chance of dropping out, while at the other extreme, any random Hispanic kid would have a 1 in 8 chance, with all of the racial categories falling somewhere in between. So let's be clear about underachieving. That means the failure of many of those who stay in school to excel according to the instructional bookkeeping required by the system. So in 2009, the National High School Transcript Study, also from the National Center for Education Statistics, showed that 1 in 4 graduates were below standards. So even though they graduated, they weren't meeting basic standards. And there's a third major symptom that's currently being ignored. The underappreciated additional symptom is faux achievers. Let me tell you about my experience of high school math, my sophomore year, 1984, with Mr. Schuster. So I faithfully jumped through all the hoops Mr. Schuster put in front of me. I scored reasonably well on his tests, and he gave me perfectly acceptable grades. And you should know, I was attending a college prep magnet program. I was in class with the very best students in the Long Beach Unified School District in California. We were expected to be engaged and accomplished learners. But in reality, me and a number of my friends and classmates were accomplished at gaming the system, at being faux achievers. Now, flash forward to the beginning of my junior year of math. When I took the assessment of skills at the beginning of the year, I failed so utterly and completely that my new math teacher saw no hope of my catching up. So she assigned me independent study, working on SAT preparation manuals for the entire semester, so I could retake that test in December. She told me that she knew I could master the strategies for taking the test because my performance in Mr. Schuster's class proved that I had the ability to go through the motions without mastering the material. And my performance on the SAT, in turn, proved that she was correct. My math score improved 120 points, going from 500 to 620 when the scale was 800. My English score went up only 50 points, from 560 to 610. Though she did not have the term, she recognized that I was a successful faux achiever. I wasn't underachieving, I wasn't overachieving, I wasn't even run-of-the-mill achieving. I was faux achieving, doing only enough to look good on the terms set by the system, but in a way that diminished the learning benefits of instruction that are normally expected. So, as a faux achiever, I knew how to do the minimal amount of work to get as much as I wanted from the system. And I'm certainly not unique. Howard Gardner of Multiple Intelligences fame pointed out in his 2004 book, The Unschooled Mind, that a majority of people with advanced degrees in every subject are prone to failing practical tests of their fields of specialty when the problems are presented to them in ways that are different from how they were normally tested in school. So if they don't get the problem presented to them in a way that they expect, then they cannot solve the problem. In other words, most master's degrees do not indicate mastery. They indicate faux achievement. Now, according to Gardner, the odds of being a faux achiever are worse than 1 in 2. So more than half the people who are supposed to be benefiting the most from our system of schooling are actually being cheated. They're cheated out of attaining mastery in their field of specialty more than half the time. So the big 3 symptoms of the failures of our K-12 school system are dropping out, failing to achieve, and faux achievement. Now, the fundamental mission of the school system is to provide an education to all children. There may be a great diversity of opinions about what that means and how to accomplish it. But everyone would have to agree that since we've legally mandated school attendance, then an education for all children is the goal. Each of these symptoms indicate a form of failure to achieve it. The dropouts have completely disengaged from school. The failures have disengaged from the work required to participate successfully in the classroom. And faux-achievers have disengaged from at least some of their subject matter, such that they don't get the full learning benefits because they're gaming the system. So these symptoms indicate that the fundamental problem in K-12 schooling is systemic disengagement, which is a problem with motivation. To be more precise, the fundamental problem is that traditional schools consistently kill intrinsic motivation. And we know exactly how the system kills intrinsic motivation. The system kills it by thwarting primary psychological needs for competence, relatedness, and autonomy. By primary, I mean that these needs are just as important to psychological well-being as air, water, food, sleep, and shelter are to biological well-being. For the dropouts, it was the neglect of relatedness. The schools were alienating instead of welcoming. For those who failed to achieve, there were not adequate opportunities for self-expression. The school system was controlling instead of autonomy supportive. And for the faux achievers like me, the system does not adequately support us to find and follow our passions and interests. Schools require only trivial engagement with subjects of study instead of requiring actual mastery. Now, critics have been pointing this out for over 100 years. But the data that proved they are actually correct was collected over the last 30 years or so. And only since 2009 has published peer-reviewed scientific evidence shown that a different pattern is in fact actually occurring in certain kinds of schools. My psychology thesis, which was published in the journal Other Education in 2013, was one of those studies. I looked at the patterns of motivation in a democratic school and a homeschool resource center. In contrast to the decline in intrinsic motivation found in all traditional schools studied to date, I found that those particular schools maintained their students' intrinsic motivation. One of the other two published works showing similar results was a study of EdVision's charter schools. EdVision's is a network of over 40 charter schools in 10 states. The third study directly compared Israeli democratic schools to traditional schools, and actually specifically around science education. So the Israeli study replicated the findings of disengagement in traditional schools and also found, like I did, a pattern of maintenance of motivation in the democratic schools. So over the years, I've consistently been a champion of self-directed learning, which is one of the things that all these three kinds of schools have in common. Well, years ago, I had intuited the following belief, for which my research and the findings of the other research groups provide a more rigorous foundation. Every adult responsible for children must nurture them. However, we currently have a K-12 school system that consistently forces adults to sacrifice that duty on the altar of instructional bookkeeping. This is wrong. This is important, so I will elaborate a little. So every adult responsible for children must nurture them, where nurturing means just supporting them to meet their primary human needs. However, we currently have a K-12 school system that consistently forces adults responsible for children to sacrifice their moral duty to nurture those children on the altar of instructional bookkeeping. This is wrong. And we know we can do better because democratic schools, a homeschool resource center, and the EdVision's charter network have already shown the way in scientifically respectable terms. The main challenge we face, the big we, if we are committed to achieving the goal of educating all children, is extracting appropriate lessons from these self-directed learning communities. My current work is about what we should be learning from these alternatives and how to apply these lessons in existing schools. So my overall suggestion is to take a principled approach to changing the existing school system by drawing on local expertise, for instance, rather than attempting to prescribe blanket solutions. In fact, it would be self-defeating to impose solutions that dictate support for the primary human need for autonomy. It's kind of a contradiction to try and say autonomy, but you're going to be imposed on. My new book is called Every Parent's Dilemma: Why Do We Ignore Schools That Nurture Children? And it is about how we can take the first step by putting a policy in place that explicitly acknowledges primary human needs as the proper foundation for education, and how we can measure progress towards putting that foundation in place. I've also founded an organization called Schools of Conscience, a political nonprofit to build that nurturing capacity in all K-12 schools. So our current school system was designed and is managed in ways that inadvertently neglect or thwart primary human needs. But we can change that. We can change it by addressing the fundamental problem of systemic disengagement. By enabling K-12 schools to support the children in their care to meet their primary human needs, we will build the capacity of the schools to be nurturing places. Places where children are welcomed, all children are welcomed. Places where all children find abundant opportunities to express themselves. And places where all children with the desire to learn will not even have the option of just going through the motions, but will be made to attain mastery in order to pass. Thanks for your joining me, and I hope you will join me in remodeling the K-12 system to be those kinds of places.